The chair I am sitting in was not designed for human use. That is the first thing I want the Commission to understand. The room, the table, the slight incline of the floor toward the central drain, none of it was built with human anatomy in mind. When the Colonial Threat Assessment Directorate requisitioned this facility after the cessation, we debated whether to refit it. Director Amara Pelletier argued for demolition. I argued for preservation. The room is, after all, a document. It is the room where Overseer 3rd Vrethali Kasamintham sat for 19 days, while my colleagues asked it questions it did not, at first, believe we were entitled to ask. I won the debate. The room stands. The drain has been sealed with a steel plate, but it is still there beneath your feet. My name is Severin Okafor. I hold the rank of Senior Analyst, Colonial Threat Assessment Directorate, Intelligence Division, 2nd Tier. I have held that rank for 14 years. I did not receive a promotion after the activation event. I want that on the record as well. Not as a grievance, I am not here to file a grievance, but as a fact relevant to the Commission's understanding of how this institution treated the data I brought to it. I first flagged the tending protocol in the 3rd month of my 2nd year on the outer reach desk. That was 11 years before the activation. I am going to walk the Commission through those 11 years because the Commission has asked me to, and because I believe the full account is the only one that serves the dead. The 6,300,000 dead. I will use that number plainly and without softening, because the Charathi Dominion used their own number plainly in their own internal record. Their number was different. Their number was yield. I prefer mine. The outer reach desk, when I assumed it, was considered a secondary posting. The Charathi Dominion had been in formal contact with the colonial authority for 31 years at that point. They were not classified as a threat tier entity. They were classified as a trade partner, commercial grade, restricted access. The Dominion administered 11 systems at the outer boundary of what we then called the Shear, a transitional zone between our colonial expansion and the Dominion's older territorial core. We had 41 colonies in the Shear. They had resource extraction operations in 8 systems adjacent to ours, and 3 systems that overlapped in terms of survey claims. The dispute over survey claims had been adjudicated twice. Both times, the colonial authority ceded the contested systems in exchange for favorable shipping lane access. Both adjudications were considered diplomatic successes. The desk officer before me had noted in his transition document that the Charathi were amenable to negotiated outcomes and reliably non-aggressive in territorial contests. He recommended continued engagement at the commercial tier. I inherited his files. I inherited his contacts. I also inherited something he had not flagged, because it was not in his portfolio. A series of agricultural survey transmissions from the Dominion's Outer Operations Bureau that had been routed, apparently in error, through a relay station at Hevel's Junction. The relay station's automatic sorter had filed them under colonial infrastructure, because the transmissions used a frequency also used by Colonial Authority Irrigation Management Services. They had been sitting in the infrastructure queue for 8 months. I read them because I was new, and I read everything. The transmissions were in the Dominion's commercial cipher, which we had a partial key for. I could read perhaps 60% of the content. What I could read described something the Dominion called, in its own translation layer, a tending schedule. The schedule referenced 41 survey nodes. The survey nodes matched in their spatial coordinates the positions of 41 human colony worlds in the outer reach. I flagged this in a Grade 2 memo on a Tuesday afternoon. The memo was reviewed by my section chief, who noted that the Dominion operated extensive agricultural concerns in the Shear, and that the tending schedule terminology was consistent with their documented practice of long-cycle biological monitoring of resource-adjacent zones. He downgraded the flag to informational. He suggested I focus on shipping lane utilization metrics, which were the desk's primary performance indicator. I continued reading. Over the following 6 months, I reconstructed enough of the transmission record to determine 3 things. First, the 41 survey nodes were not being passively monitored. They were being actively seeded. The tending schedule described a distribution mechanism. The Dominion's own word in their own cipher was something that translates most accurately as inoculation. Though I want the Commission to understand that this is a Dominion agricultural term with no medical analog in their usage. To the Dominion, inoculating a zone meant introducing a biological agent at a low, dormant level so that the zone's organic substrate would be prepared for later harvest. The 41 colony worlds were being inoculated with a biological agent. The agent was dormant. We did not yet know what it was designed to do when it activated. Second, the seeding had been underway for at least 3 years before the transmission intercept, possibly longer. Third, the Dominion's tending schedule included a date. In their reckoning, a convergence point. In ours, 11 years from the date of the first transmission I had read. I escalated from a Grade 2 memo to a Grade 4 memo. A Grade 4 memo required a formal response from the section chief within 30 days. The formal response came in 22 days. It noted that the intercept was of uncertain provenance, that partial key translations were methodologically unreliable, and that the colonial authorities' biological survey teams had completed a standard ecological assessment of the outer reach colonies 18 months prior and found no anomalous readings. The Grade 4 flag was closed. The case file was transferred from active to reference status. I kept a personal copy. I want to be precise about what happened over the next 9 years, because the Commission has heard other testimony describing this period, and some of that testimony has been, in my professional assessment, imprecise. I was not ignored because my colleagues were negligent. I was not ignored because the institution was corrupt. I was ignored because I was right in a way that the institution had no category for. The Colonial Threat Assessment Directorate was built to identify military threats, fleet movements, fortification patterns, weapons technology acquisition. It was built, secondarily, to identify political threats, alliance shifts, factional instability, embargo strategies. It was not built to identify what the Dominion was doing, because the Dominion was not doing any of those things. The Dominion was doing something for which our institution had no vocabulary. They were farming. They had looked at 41 human colony worlds and made a calculation. The calculation, as I eventually reconstructed it from Overseer 3rd Casamentham's testimony in this room, was as follows. The organic biomass of a colony world, the colonists, their livestock, their cultivated plants, the secondary organisms their agriculture had introduced, the soil microbiome they had spent decades enriching, was worth, in Dominion yield metric terms, approximately 14 times the commercial value of the raw mineral deposits in the same system. Colonized worlds were, by the Dominion's accounting, more valuable than uncolonized ones. The colonists had done the preparation work. The colonists had enriched the substrate. The colonists were, in the Dominion's agricultural framework, technically classified as a soil amendment organism, a category that also included earthworms and nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They did not hate us. That is the thing that I want the Commission to carry out of this room. The Chirathi Dominion did not hate humanity. They had no particular opinion about humanity. We were useful. We attended their resource zones without knowing it, and in 11 years they intended to harvest what we had grown. The tending protocol was not a weapon. It was not designed as a weapon. It was an agricultural tool, and the 41 human colony worlds were the field. I escalated twice more over those 9 years. A Grade 6 memo in the 7th year when I had obtained, through a source I am not at liberty to name before the Commission, a partial schematic of the bioagent's activation mechanism. I knew by then what it did. When activated by a specific modulated signal, broadcast on a frequency the Dominion had never used openly in our presence, the agent's dormant state would end. It would begin replicating. It was designed to cross mammalian blood-brain barriers, to interfere with cellular respiration at the mitochondrial level, and to do so with a latency that would prevent immediate identification of the cause. The colonists would become ill. They would not be able to identify why. Over 72 hours, organ systems would fail. The process was designed to be, in the Dominion's terminology, non-destructive to substrate, meaning that the organic matter would remain intact and harvestable after cellular death. The Dominion's harvest ships, which I had by then identified operating in a holding pattern in the deep shear, would arrive within a standard cycle. The Grade 6 memo was reviewed at the deputy director level. The deputy director requested additional sourcing. I provided what I could. He sent the case to the Colonial Authority's Biological Survey Division for independent assessment. The Biological Survey Division's assessment took 4 months and concluded that the ecological readings from the outer reach colonies were within normal parameters. The case was returned to reference status. 2 years later, I submitted a Grade 8 memo, the highest grade available to an analyst without a flag from a division director, and requested emergency interdiction of the 41 colony worlds and immediate collection of environmental samples using non-standard detection protocols. The Grade 8 memo was reviewed by Director Pelletier herself. She called me into her office. She sat across from me and read the memo and the 12-year file and the reconstructed transmission log and the partial bioagent schematic. She read for 2 hours. I sat in the chair across the desk and watched her read. When she finished, she closed the file and looked at me for a long time. She said, "Akafer, if you're right, we have a problem we don't know how to solve. If you're wrong, the diplomatic cost of what you're recommending is severe." I said, "Director, I am not wrong." She said, "I know you believe that." The Grade 8 memo was elevated to the Colonial Authority's Security Council with a notation that it represented one analyst's assessment and had not been independently verified. The Security Council reviewed it in closed session. The Security Council requested a diplomatic inquiry, a quiet formal query to the Charathi Dominion's trade representative regarding any biological monitoring programs the Dominion might be conducting in the shear. The Dominion's trade representative provided a detailed and technically accurate response describing the Dominion's standard agricultural long-cycle monitoring practices, which were, as the representative noted, fully disclosed in the Commercial Engagement Treaty signed 39 years prior. The Security Council found no grounds for escalation. That was 8 months before the activation. I spent those 8 months preparing. I want to be clear, I was not supposed to be preparing. I was supposed to be managing the outer reach desk, tracking shipping lane utilization metrics, and waiting for the Security Council's diplomatic inquiry to run its course. Instead, I was documenting. I was building a record that could survive what I believed was coming. I made copies of everything. I transmitted encrypted caches to 3 off-network servers that I had arranged through means I will fully disclose to the Commission in closed session if required. I wrote a summary document, not a memo, not a formal flag, a plain document in plain language, describing what the Charathi Dominion was going to do, and when it was going to do it, and what Earth's response should be. I also, in the 5th of those 8 months, submitted an unsanctioned request to the Colonial Authority's Medical Research Division, asking whether there existed any broad-spectrum biological detection protocol capable of identifying an unknown dormant, engineered agent in a dispersed colonial biosphere. I used my own name. I described the hypothetical in terms that would have been recognizable to anyone who had read my Grade 6 memo, which the medical division had not. The request was reviewed by a senior researcher named Dr. Vanya Osai, no relation to the ship engineer from my team, though the Commission may note the same surname in other testimony, who replied in a polite 3-paragraph communication that the scenario described was, from a biosurveillance standpoint, essentially undetectable by standard protocols, and that any detection of a novel dormant agent in distributed colony ecosystems would require targeted sampling campaigns using non-standard assay equipment that the colonial authority did not currently field. She asked at the end of her reply whether this was a theoretical inquiry or an operational concern. I told her it was theoretical. I was not willing to cost her her career alongside mine. I kept her reply in my file. It is Exhibit 47 if the Commission wishes to locate it. The last 2 months of the 8 I spent in a particular kind of stillness that I have not found an adequate description for. I had done what I could do. I had built the record. I had put the document in front of 7 people. I had mapped, as precisely as I could from open sources, the position and heading of the Dominion's harvest ships, which by my calculation would reach holding distance from the outer reach within 60 days of the convergence point on the Dominion's tending schedule. I had calculated that if the Security Council chose to act on even a fraction of my Grade 8 memo, the minimum interdiction timeline was 45 days from authorization to deployment in the shear. We had the time. We had almost exactly the time if someone decided to move. No one decided to move. I sat at my desk in the 8th month and watched the Dominion's trade representative give a quarterly address to the colonial authorities' commercial liaison board. The representative was a senior official of the Outer Operations Bureau named Yaveth Koss, a different Koss than the Overseer Third I would eventually sit across from in this room, though the Commission may note the shared designation. It delivered a competent presentation on shipping lane utilization in the shear over the previous quarter. The charts were thorough. The projections were, in hindsight, grounded in an assumption about what the shear would look like after the convergence point that the colonial authorities' commercial liaison board was not in a position to evaluate. I watched the presentation from the back of the room. I had not been invited. I had no standing reason to be there. I was there because I wanted to look at the official who ran the bureau that had seeded 41 human worlds and understand whether there was anything in its manner that would tell me I was wrong. There was not. It was entirely ordinary. It answered questions from the board in clear, measured language. It thanked the board for its continued partnership. It expressed confidence in the strength of the commercial relationship between the Dominion and the colonial authority going forward. I left before the reception. I gave that document to 7 people. 3 of them were colleagues. 2 were journalists whose security clearances I had no authority to trust but whose channels I believed would survive institutional pressure. 1 was my section chief, who had downgraded my first flag 11 years before, and who I believed deserved to know what his decision had been part of. 1 was Director Pelletier. Director Pelletier read the document in my presence. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she was going to have me transferred to the Colonial Agricultural Liaison Desk as a precautionary measure, pending a review of my methodology, and that the transfer should not be read as a disciplinary action. I was packing my desk when the activation happened. I will not describe the activation in clinical terms. The Commission has the clinical record. I will tell you what I knew in the first hours, because what I knew in the first hours is part of the record of this institution's failure and part of the record of what came after. The first signal came from Brennan's World, one of the 41, a colony of 240,000. The Colonial Medical Authority transmitted an emergency report at 3:12 station time. Mass illness, unidentified cause, rapid onset, no external contamination source identified. By 600, 12 of the 41 colonies were reporting the same pattern. By 900, all 41. I was not at my desk. I had been escorted to the Colonial Agricultural Liaison Desk, which was on a different floor, and my access credentials had been downgraded as part of the review. I was sitting at a workstation I did not know, watching the alerts come through on the public Colonial Authority feed, when Director Pelletier walked up behind me. She did not say anything. She handed me a security token that restored my full access credentials. She walked away. I worked for 72 hours without sleeping. The 72 hours were the length of the dying. That is not a coincidence. The tending protocol was calibrated to complete its cycle in 72 hours because the Dominion's harvest ship approach time from their holding position in the deep shear was 76 hours. They had built in a 4-hour margin. The margin was careful. The margin was the work of engineers who had thought about this for a long time. 6,312,814 human beings died over 72 hours across 41 worlds in the outer reach. The number is precise because we counted. We counted everyone. It took us 4 months to finish counting, because some of the worlds had limited record-keeping infrastructure and some of the records were damaged, but we finished, and the number is the number I have given. I have been asked by several parties over the years to use a rounded figure in public statements, because the precision of the number is, in some contexts, considered distressing. I have declined each time. The precision of the number is the point. The Dominion's harvest ships arrived 74 hours after the activation. They were intercepted by Colonial Authority patrol vessels, which were not in any sense equipped to stop them but were present, and which transmitted the situation report that allowed Earth to understand, within hours, what had happened and who had done it. The Dominion's ships did not fire on the patrol vessels. They attempted to proceed to their assigned harvest coordinates. The patrol vessels placed themselves in the approach corridors. The Dominion's lead ship broadcast a communication on a standard diplomatic frequency, informing the patrol vessels that they were obstructing a licensed commercial operation and requesting that they stand clear. The commander of the senior patrol vessel, a lieutenant named Bryn Cho, transmitted a single response. She said, "You are not going anywhere near those worlds. We will die in these corridors before we move." Then she cut the channel. They did not fire on her. They withdrew to holding distance. They waited. I believe they expected a negotiation to follow. There was no negotiation. I was in the Colonial Authority's emergency session room when Director Pelletier walked in, 41 hours after the activation, and laid my 12-year case file on the table in front of the Security Council. She said, "This analyst has been correct for 11 years. I want the council to look at him and understand that." She said my name. She said it clearly. Every person in the room looked at me. Then she said, "Now let's talk about what we do." I want to tell the Commission what those 6 days looked like from inside the building, because I have read other accounts of those 6 days, and they describe them in terms of institutional resolve and coordinated response and decisive leadership. And those accounts are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The 6 days were also 318 analysts working in shifts across 11 different assessment streams. A biological analysis team from the Colonial Authority's Medical Research Division, including Dr. Vanya Osai, who had answered my theoretical inquiry 8 months before and who, when she understood what she was being asked to analyze, worked without sleeping for 50 hours, confirming by day 2 that the agent was engineered, that the activation mechanism matched the partial schematic I had submitted in my grade 6 memo 7 years prior, and that it had been present in the colony world biospheres for a minimum of 9 years. A diplomatic communications team logging the Dominion's formal notification that the 41 worlds were now Tier 1 agricultural resource zones. The harvest ships in holding pattern, still waiting. Lieutenant Cho's patrol vessels still in the approach corridors, down to emergency rations by day 4, none of them having moved. It was also the section chief who had downgraded my first grade 2 flag coming to find me in the emergency analysis room on day 3. He stood at the door for a while. I was at a workstation building a structural map of the tending protocol's activation chain. He said my name. I told him I was busy. He said he knew. He stood there for another moment and then he left. I do not know what he was going to say. I have thought about it. I do not think it would have mattered what he said, and I do not think he thought so either. It was the Dominion's diplomatic communication, received on day 4, that settled the debate in the room in a way that Pelletier's argument alone might not have. The formal notification was not an apology, not an explanation, not even a negotiating position. It was a commercial declaration. The 41 worlds, with their populations dead, were being claimed as Dominion property. The Dominion was not hiding what it had done. It had done a thing that, in its framework, required no hiding. It had completed an agricultural operation and was filing the appropriate title documentation. The harvest ships were waiting for the legal filing to be acknowledged before proceeding to the resource zones. I read the communication in the room with the Security Council's full membership present. I read it 3 times. I looked up and said, "They expect us to negotiate over the paperwork." No one in the room said anything. Director Pelletier said, "They do." The decision was not unanimous. I want to say that clearly. There were voices for proportional response. There were voices for sanctions, for formal indictment before the Interstellar Commerce Tribunal, for the establishment of an exclusion zone. There were voices that said the Dominion did not understand what they had done, that the framework in which they had done it was so alien to human moral reasoning that a retributive military response would fail to communicate anything they were capable of receiving. Director Pelletier sat through those arguments without expression. When they were done, she said, "I have an analyst in this building who has been correct for 11 years. Every argument you have just made, someone made to me at some point over those 11 years. I declined to act on them then. 6 million people are dead. I will not decline to act on them again." The Earth Consolidated Defense Authority voted 17-4 for what was designated Resolution 7 Ardent. Resolution 7 Ardent authorized the deployment of the Ardent Clause. 452,000 warships assembled from Earth's standing defense forces, reserve fleets, and the shipyards that had been operating at surge capacity for the 6 days since the activation, to prosecute total disassembly of every Charathi Dominion installation, habitat, station, ship, and archive structure across the 22 systems of the Dominion's territorial core. The 8 resource extraction systems adjacent to the outer reach, and the 3 survey claim systems. The resolution specified that Charathi civilian population centers be treated as non-combatant under the engagement protocols, that evacuation corridors be established and maintained, and that the disassembly operations be conducted on all non-civilian structures regardless of their function, with no exceptions. The resolution also specified that the Dominion's complete agricultural operation record, including all data related to the tending protocol and any other biological programs targeting non-Charathi populations, be seized intact wherever possible, and that the chain of command for the tending protocol authorization be identified, documented, and held for trial before a competent human or recognized interstellar tribunal. The resolution did not specify a maximum duration. The operations officer who drafted the logistics plan, a woman named Commodore Tando, estimated 30 to 35 days. She was wrong by 4 days. It took 31. I attended 4 of the 11 days of fleet assembly planning sessions. I was there because Director Pelletier had insisted that a senior analyst from the Outer Reach desk be embedded in the command element, and because I was the only analyst whose 12-year file gave me an adequate map of the Dominion's installation registry. I sat at a table with flag officers and logistics planners and naval architects, and I answered questions about the Dominion system configurations, their archive locations, their installation construction dates, their civilian-to-military footprint ratios. I answered them from memory mostly, because I had been building the file for 12 years. On the 8th day, Commodore Tando asked me how confident I was in the installation registry completeness figure I had given her the day before, a figure of 94%, meaning I believed my compiled list of Dominion installations was complete to approximately 94% of the actual total. I told her the figure was conservative, and that I expected the on-site seizure teams to find additional installations once they had access to the Dominion's own archive, and that the list would need to be updated in the first days of operations. She said, So we're going in with a list that will grow once we're already there. I said yes. She looked at the list. She looked at it for a while. Then she said, "All right, we close everything on the list, and we close everything the list doesn't have that the archive turns up. The ledger doesn't close until everything closes." I said, "That is exactly right." She nodded once and went back to her charts. I believe that exchange is why the ledger was designed the way it was designed. I cannot confirm that, but that is what I believe. I was aboard the analysis vessel Kerrigan's Margin for the duration of the campaign. The Kerrigan's Margin was not a warship. It was a converted survey vessel attached to the Ardent Claw's command element, crewed by 41 intelligence analysts. 1. As Director Pelletier had insisted, for each of the 41 worlds. My assignment was Brennan's world. I had chosen it because it was where the first signal had come from. I will not describe the Ardent Claw's operations in tactical detail. The Commission has that record. What I will describe is what the operations looked like from the observation deck of the Kerrigan's Margin, because that is what I was present for, and because I believe the Commission should hear it in a human voice. The Ardent Claws did not arrive in the Dominion systems with aggression and fire. It arrived with precision. The fleet navigators had done 11 days of coordinated jump calculation. The fleet arrived in 16 Dominion systems simultaneously, within a 40-second window, so that no Dominion installation in any system would have time to receive warning from another before Earth was already present. The timing was not a military tactic. It was an accounting procedure. We were closing the ledger. I was watching from the observation deck when the lead formation of the Ardent Claws emerged from jump in the Charathi home system, a deep yellow star the Dominion called the Provident Eye, which I had been staring at on charts for 12 years. The fleet came out of jump in 4 waves, each wave arriving 7 seconds after the last, the hulls materializing out of nothing at the edge of the system's navigational boundary and immediately resolving into formation. I counted the waves without meaning to. I have trained myself to count. It is a professional reflex. The first communication from the Ardent Claw's command vessel, a ship called the Riven Compact, under Fleet Admiral Ewan Dacquerai, was not a declaration of war. We had not declared war. Resolution 7 Ardent was not a declaration of war. It was a closure order. The communication was read on all Dominion frequencies in the Dominion's own primary language, by a translator who had been part of my team for 9 years. It said, in substance, the Charathi Dominion's tending protocol had been designated a crime against humanity by the Earth Consolidated Defense Authority. The Dominion's agricultural archive was to be surrendered intact. All military and commercial vessels were to power down and stand by for boarding. All non-civilian installations and structures were to be vacated within 4 hours. The Ardent Claws would begin disassembly operations at the conclusion of the 4-hour window. There was no negotiation phase, no counteroffer, no diplomatic back channel. The communication ended. The Dominion's response came 40 minutes later from what we identified as the Dominion's Agricultural Coordination Bureau. The response was not military. The Dominion's military, such as it was a defense force designed for border enforcement against the resource raiders they occasionally encountered, not for anything resembling the Ardent Claws, had stood down within 20 minutes of fleet arrival. The response was bureaucratic. It cited the Commercial Engagement Treaty. It noted that the tending protocol was a licensed agricultural operation conducted in accordance with Dominion agricultural law. It requested a formal hearing before the Interstellar Commerce Tribunal. Fleet Admiral Dacquerai transmitted a single reply. The hearing will be conducted after. If you have personnel in non-civilian structures, move them now. They moved them. I watched the disassembly of the Charathi Agricultural Coordination Bureau's Central Archive Tower from a distance of roughly 1,200 kilometers, standing at the observation deck's forward rail with a cup of cold coffee I had forgotten to drink. The tower was not a military installation. It was an office building, by any functional definition, the bureaucratic heart of the operation that had ended 6 million lives, but a building nonetheless, full of filing systems and administrative personnel, and the kind of institutional furniture that accretes around any sufficiently old organization. The personnel had evacuated. The filing systems had been imaged and seized by a boarding team 40 minutes before. The ardent claws did not use its most powerful armament on the tower. That would have been disproportionate in the wrong direction, wasteful, not purposeful. A single disassembly unit from the fleet's engineering division came alongside and began structural deconstruction at the foundation level. I watched the tower come apart the way a very old building comes apart when someone removes its load-bearing elements with precision. It did not explode. It did not burn. It folded slowly from the bottom, each section descending in sequence as the structural members were removed. It took 11 minutes to bring down a tower that had been built over the course of 200 years. I did not feel what I expected to feel watching it. I had spent 11 years being right, and I had expected that being right would feel like something. It felt like watching an audit close. The numbers were resolving. The account was being corrected. That was the only vocabulary I had for it, and I have thought about whether that vocabulary is inadequate to the moral weight of what we were doing, and I have concluded that it is not. The Dominion had run an account against us for 11 years. The account was being closed. The precision of the closure, the care with which it was conducted, the evacuation corridors maintained, the civilian population centers untouched, the methodical working through of every installation in the ledger, was not a failure of appropriate feeling. It was the appropriate feeling. Grief that has been waiting 11 years for permission to become action does not look like rage. It looks like work. 31 days. The ardent claws worked through the Dominion's 22 systems with the tempo that Commodore Tando's logistics plan had established, and the precision that 11 days of coordinated planning had made possible. The disassembly teams moved from system to system in sequence. The archive seizure teams preceded them. The evacuation monitors verified civilian compliance. The engineering units removed the structures. The fleet recorded everything. I received daily summary reports from each of the 40 other analysts aboard the Kerrigan's Margin. 40 worlds, 40 data streams, 40 running tallies of Dominion installations identified, vacated, seized, and removed. I maintained the running total for Brennan's world separately, in my own notation system, the one I had been using for 12 years. On day 19, I was able to confirm that the last Dominion installation associated with the Tending Protocol's distribution infrastructure, a relay station in the outer system of what the Dominion called the Fourth Reach, which had been used to broadcast the activation signal, had been identified, its technical record seized, and its structure decommissioned. I sat with that confirmation for a while. I had found the relay station's existence in my second year. I had noted its coordinates in a Grade 2 memo that had been downgraded to informational. I looked at my 12-year file and found the original memo and read the coordinates I had written down. They matched. I closed the file. I did not throw it away. I never throw anything away. What the 31 days were, in texture rather than summary, was this. It was predominantly quiet. People imagine a campaign of this scale as continuous noise, alarm klaxons, combat reports, the percussion of ordnance at close range. The ardent claws was none of that. For most of its duration, what it was, from aboard the Kerrigan's Margin, was a sustained, low hum of procedure. The boarding parties submitted their archive seizure receipts. The disassembly teams filed their completion reports. The evacuation monitors confirmed civilian clearances in their standard format. The fleet navigators updated the approach charts for each successive system. The operations officer aboard the Riven Compact annotated the master ledger. I reviewed the daily ledger every evening. I had been given access to it as the senior analysis officer on the embedded team. It was a document of considerable bureaucratic precision. Each installation listed by Dominion catalog number, system location, structural classification, operational status, seizure team identifier, disassembly team identifier, completion timestamp, and a single-word status field. The status field contained either pending, in process, or complete. On day 1, the ledger had 347 installations listed. On day 31, every status field read complete. I do not know who decided the ledger should be designed that way. I would like to know. I would like to thank them. The analysts on the Kerrigan's margin were not uniformly composed during the 31 days. Some of them were fine. Some of them were not. I am the senior analyst on this commission's witness list, and I have been asked to speak to operational procedure, not personal welfare. But I want the commission to have this on the record. There were 41 of us, each assigned to a world, and some of us had been working those worlds' casualty figures for months before the Ardent Claws departed, and some of us had been doing it since the activation, and some had not come to it until they were assigned to the Kerrigan's margin. The ones who had not been living with the numbers for long had a harder time. I am not saying that as a criticism. I am saying it because I think the commission should understand that the 31 days were not conducted from a place of cold professional detachment for most of the people conducting them. They were conducted from a place of grief that had been organized into procedure. That is a different thing, and it is harder, and the people who did it are owed a more careful accounting than they have generally received. The Dominion's formal request for a Commerce Tribunal hearing was received and logged. It was acknowledged. The acknowledgment stated that the Earth Consolidated Defense Authority was prepared to participate in a tribunal proceeding upon completion of the Ardent Clause's operations, and that Earth would present its case with the complete tending protocol archive as supporting evidence. The Dominion submitted a supplementary communication 3 days later. The supplementary communication acknowledged, for the first time in any formal document, that the tending protocol had been applied to inhabited human worlds, and that the activation of the protocol had resulted in human deaths. The communication characterized these deaths as an unintended consequence of agricultural operations, conducted in a zone that had not been formally designated as a protected civilian area under any treaty to which the Dominion was a signatory. Fleet Admiral Dacquerai acknowledged receipt of this communication and transmitted a brief reply. 6,312,814. That is the number of unintended consequences. We have the individual names if you require them. There was no further communication from the Dominion until the Ardent Clause completed its operations on day 31. I am going to spend some time on the cost, because the Commission has asked me about the cost, and because I believe the Commission deserves a straight answer to a question that is often answered evasively. The Ardent Clause lost 11,412 personnel over the 31 days. The majority of those losses occurred in systems where the Dominion's defense force, despite standing down its fleet operations, had not communicated the stand-down order to automated perimeter installations. There were 17 separate incidents involving automated defensive fire. The Ardent Clause's rules of engagement required that automated defensive installations be treated as active combatants if they fired, and that they be neutralized, not disassembled, a distinction that mattered in the moment of contact. 11,412. We counted those, too. I want to say something about that number that has not been said in the other testimony the Commission has heard. Those losses were known to be a possibility before the Ardent Clause departed. Fleet Admiral Dacquerai's pre-operation briefing estimated potential losses in the range of 8 to 15,000, based on modeling of the Dominion's automated perimeter systems. The fleet went anyway. Every one of those 11,412 people knew the estimate, or could have known it, and they went anyway. I am not going to tell the Commission what moral weight to assign to that. I am going to tell the Commission that I know their names too, and that they are in my file alongside the other 6 million. Overseer 3rd Vrethali Kasamentham was identified as the senior surviving member of the Tending Protocol's authorization chain on day 24. It had been sheltering in a civilian habitat in the Dominion's third system. The evacuation monitors had noted its presence and flagged it for my team. It was brought to the Kerrigan's margin by a boarding party on day 26, 5 days before the Ardent Claw's operations concluded. The Commission will have seen the interrogation record. I will summarize what is relevant to this testimony. Overseer 3rd Kasamentham was a mid-level administrator in the Dominion's Agricultural Coordination Bureau, which is to say, it was not among the most senior decision-makers in the Tending Protocol's chain of command. It was, however, the most senior surviving member of that chain available to us. The most senior members had been aboard the harvest ships that Lieutenant Cho had intercepted. Those ships had been boarded on day 1, and the chain of command documentation seized from their records had been detailed and thorough. The senior authorization for the Tending Protocol had come from a body called the Dominion's 7th Cultivation Assembly, a standing committee responsible for long-cycle agricultural planning, which had been convened as a body in a hall that was, by day 3 of the Ardent Claw's operations, a carefully documented and fully decommissioned site. Kasamentham had sat in this room for 19 days. I had been present for 9 of them. The Overseer 3rd was not what I had imagined. Over 12 years of building a file on the thing its bureau had done. It was smaller than its official dimensions suggested. Charathi bureaucratic records list individuals by volume, not height, and a mid-tier overseer's listed volume had given me a mental image of something imposing. In person, it was compact, with a slightly convex posture that its species adopts under what we eventually identified as a state of confusion. It was confused because it genuinely did not understand what it was being held for. Not because it didn't know what the Tending Protocol had done. It knew. When we showed it the casualty figures, it read them without apparent distress, in the same way that a grain warehouse manager might read a harvest yield report. It understood that 6.3 million humans were dead. It understood that the Ardent Claw was the consequence. What it did not understand, and I want this on the record because I believe it is important, was why the consequence took the form it did. On the 3rd day of its time in this room, before I arrived, my colleague Nara Ibori had asked it a direct question about the Tending Protocol's authorization chain. Kasamentham had answered fully and without hesitation. It provided names, designations, vote records, the meeting minutes of the 7th Cultivation Assembly's 3 sessions at which the protocol had been discussed and ratified. It answered the question in the way that a professional would answer questions about their professional work, with clarity and precision and without the behavioral markers that, in a human subject, would indicate shame or concealment. It was not concealing. It was explaining. There was, to its understanding, nothing to conceal. Ibori told me about this exchange before I took my first session with the Overseer 3rd. She said, "I don't think it's performing cooperation. I think it genuinely doesn't know why we're asking." I asked her if that made it harder or easier to work with. She said, "I don't know yet. I know now after 9 sessions. Both. It was both harder and easier. In ways that cancel out to something that is simply different from anything I had prepared for." It asked me on the 11th day of its time in this room through the translator, "Why did you disassemble the archive? The archive is the record of the protocol. If you intend to bring this matter before a tribunal, you would need the archive as evidence. We would have provided it." I told it that we had the archive. We had seized it before decommissioning the buildings that housed it. It was quiet for a time, then it asked, "Why did you decommission the buildings?" I said, "Because they were part of the infrastructure of the Tending Protocol." It said, "The buildings did not kill your people. The protocol killed your people." I said, "Yes." It was quiet for longer this time. Its posture shifted, the slight convex curve that indicated confusion deepening, by the assessment of our xenobehavioral analyst, into something closer to what we might call bewilderment. It said, "You have destroyed, as near as I can calculate from the operational summaries provided, 108 years of accumulated Dominion institutional infrastructure, for an offense committed under the authority of the 7th Cultivation Assembly." I said 112 years by our count. We were precise. It considered that for a moment. Then it said, "The 7th Cultivation Assembly was convened for long-cycle agricultural planning. It met in formal session 4 times per standard Dominion administrative cycle. The protocol was one of 317 items on its agricultural development agenda over the period in question." I said, "I know. I have the full agenda in the archive." It said, "Then you understand that the protocol was not, in the Dominion's operational framework, a special case. It was a routine line item. The 41 worlds were an agricultural development opportunity in the standard classification." I said, "I understand that completely." It said, "And you still," it stopped. It started again. "You still removed 112 years of infrastructure for a routine line item." I said, "Yes." It sat with that. The convex posture deepened further. Our xenobehavioral analyst's notation on this session, which I have read, describes this postural state as one the Charathi exhibit when confronted with information that has no available category, not distress in the emotional sense, but a kind of active processing failure, the behavioral equivalent of an error state. It said, "Your losses were 11,000. The protocol's yield from 41 worlds would have, in Dominion economic terms, repaid the operational cost of establishing and seeding those worlds several hundred times over. You understand that you have destroyed more than the protocol's benefit would have provided, by several orders of magnitude." I said, "Yes." It said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. I had been thinking about it in various forms for 12 years. I had thought about it in Grade 2 memos and Grade 8 memos, and in the plain document I had given to 7 people, and I had thought about it on the observation deck of the Kerrigan's Margin watching a 200-year tower fold into dust in 11 minutes. I said, "Because the math isn't the point." Casamenthum did not have a response to that. It sat for a long time in the chair that was not designed for human anatomy, in the room with the sealed drain, and it did not speak. That was the question it had asked, and that was the answer I gave, and I believe it was the correct answer. I want the Commission to understand why. The Dominion had built its calculation on a single assumption, that the cost-benefit analysis of the tending protocol would hold, that Earth's response would be proportional to the measurable harm, that we would weigh the loss of 6.3 million colonists against the diplomatic and military cost of a response, and arrive at a number that made the protocol survivable. They had not built in the possibility of a response that was not a proportional calculation at all. They had not built in the ardent clause. The ardent clause was not a proportional response. It was not designed to be. It was designed to communicate something that could not be communicated proportionally, that the death of 6.3 million people was not an entry in a ledger that could be balanced, that the tending protocol was not a calculation that Earth would audit and dispute and eventually settle, that there was no yield figure, no resource assessment, no long-cycle agricultural projection large enough to make what the Dominion had done into a transaction Earth would absorb. I spent 11 years trying to get the Colonial Threat Assessment Directorate to understand what the Dominion was going to do. I failed. 6 million people died because I failed, because the institution I was part of could not recognize a threat that didn't fit its categories. I carry that. I will carry it as long as I am alive. What I did not fail at was understanding, when the time came, what the answer needed to be. The Dominion understood profit and yield and cost per unit and return on long-cycle investment. If we had answered with sanctions, they would have calculated the cost of sanctions. If we had answered with a proportional military strike, they would have calculated the cost of a proportional strike. If we had answered with anything their framework could process as a transaction, they would have processed it as a transaction, and they would have adjusted their projections accordingly. And in some future cycle, the math would work again, and they would try again. The ardent clause could not be processed as a transaction. You cannot calculate the return on investment when there is no investment left to calculate on. You cannot adjust your projections when the bureau that makes the projections has been removed at the foundation. 31 days, 452,000 warships, 22 systems, 112 years of Dominion infrastructure. The message was not, you went too far. The message was, this is what happens when you treat our dead as yield. I understand that there are people, some of them on this commission, judging by the questions I was sent in advance, who believe that the ardent clause was itself a disproportionate act, that the destruction of 112 years of Dominion institutional infrastructure, the decommissioning of facilities and archives and administrative structures that were not directly involved in the tending protocol, was beyond what justice required. I respect that argument. I have spent a great deal of time with it. I do not agree with it. I do not agree with it because justice is not the only thing a response can be. The ardent clause was not only justice. It was a statement of terms. The terms are these. If you look at a human world and see a resource zone, the response will not be proportional. If you look at human colonists and classify them as soil amendment organisms, the response will not be proportional. There is no calculation you can perform that will make the math come out in your favor, because we will not do the math. We will do the ardent clause. We will take 112 years of your institutional memory and close it out with the same care and precision with which your Agricultural Coordination Bureau built the tending protocol. And we will do it in 31 days. And we will count every individual and every structure, because counting is what we do. And then we will sit in the room with the sealed drain and answer your questions. I have answered every question I was asked in this room and in this testimony. I will continue to answer questions. I want to close with something that is not in my 12-year file, because it happened after the file was closed. On the last day of the ardent clause's operations, I was still on the observation deck of the Kerrigan's Margin. The fleet was completing its final disassembly operations in the Dominion's outermost system. The last structure on the operations list was a small, uninhabited way station in the system's debris belt, a refueling point for Dominion agricultural survey vessels, no larger than a commercial shipping hub, decommissioned from active use some 40 years prior, but still present on the Dominion's infrastructure registry, and therefore still on our list. The disassembly team dealt with it in 20 minutes. When it was done, the operations officer aboard the Riven Compact broadcast the completion signal on the fleet-wide channel. Just the signal, no words. The fleet acknowledged. I was holding my cup of cold coffee. I have a consistent problem with cold coffee, apparently. And I was looking at the debris belt, at the space where the way station had been, which was now empty. And I thought about Brennan's world. I thought about the 240,000 people who had lived there when the first signal came through at 3:12 station time. I did not know any of them. I knew their number. I knew that the first emergency report had been transmitted by a medical officer named Pell Warris, who had died 4 hours after sending it. I knew that because I had counted. I thought about the 11 years. I thought about the grade 2 memo on the Tuesday afternoon, and the grade 4 and the grade 6 and the grade 8 in Director Pelletier's face when she read the file, and said she knew I believed I was right. I thought about the 8 months I had spent preparing for something I could not stop. I thought about Dr. Osai's polite response to a theoretical inquiry that was not theoretical. I thought about Lieutenant Cho in her approach corridor, down to emergency rations, not moving. And I thought, the account is closed. Not resolved, not forgiven, not balanced. Nothing balances 6.3 million names, but closed. The tending protocol ran for 11 years and killed what it killed, and it will not run again. Not in the Dominion systems, because there is no Dominion infrastructure left from which to run it. Not in any other system that received the record of what the Ardent Clause did, because the record is complete and the terms are stated, and the math is plain. You do not farm us. That is the statement of terms. Those 4 words are the entire statement. You do not farm us. You do not calculate our yield. You do not seed our worlds with dormant agents and schedule a harvest date and send your bureau's representatives to this room to ask me why I decommissioned the buildings. You do not farm us, because if you do, we will not negotiate the loss. We will close the account. 11,412 of our own people went into that closing and did not come back. I count them in the same column as the 6 million. They are on the same page of the same file. The file is complete. I have been an analyst for 14 years. I have been right in this matter for 12 of them. I do not say that as self-praise. I say it as a statement of professional record that I believe the Commission is entitled to have plainly stated. My recommendations were not acted on. 6 million people died. The Ardent Clause was sent. 11,000 more died sending it. The tending protocol will not be run again. I also say it because I want the Commission to understand what the institutional cost of being ignored looks like. Extended over 11 years and then 1 activation event, and then 31 days of closure. I want someone to look at the Grade 2 memo and the Grade 4 memo and the Grade 6 memo and the Grade 8 memo in sequence, and to understand the distance between the first and the last, and to carry that distance out of this room, not as a lesson in how I was treated, as a lesson in the shape of a preventable thing. 6,312,814. That is the full account. I have nothing further to add at this time.